What's up, everyone? Back with another one. I haven't made a video in a long time or recorded one. It's been a turbulent past 6 months. I did manage to edit and get one out that was already pending in that time frame. But ironically enough, talking about turbulence or turmoil in this case is something that I just impulsively picked up like a year ago. It's been sitting on my shelf, and in those 6 months, I started to read it, and certain things ran congruent with what was happening in real life. It's The Abyss by Leo Holmes. I picked it up from Miskatonic Books. For those who don't know, Miskatonic is absolutely essential for U.S. customers. They feature a lot of great publishers. This one is from Fall of Man. And I think they're out on that site, but you may be able to still get it from the publisher. It's limited edition. There's only 333 copies. But let's check out the book summary. The Abyss offers a wide approach based on both personal experience and a multidisciplinary study to the second of the two main crises of a magician's career, the first being the attainment of the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. This book is predominantly inspired by Thelemic literature, but not limited to it, drawing parallels to ancient myths of descent in intellectual, emotional, and behavioral patterns as much as archetypal concepts. It is a painful yet insightful journey that depends equally on the pilgrim and on the stars that guide him. Something else that I think is worth sharing is a review on Goodreads.com by user Grant. He writes, "Within, Holmes provides an integrated approach to better equip oneself for the trials of the Thelemic Ordeal X. Writing as a Gnostic Christian, the crossing of the abyss is essentially what Jesus accomplished as the Christ, the Chrysos, or Spirit of Gold. The crossing and Choronzon is what every pilgrim must face once he or she has, once and for all, completely disidentified with illusory phenomena. For bless our hearts, the true gold could only be found deep within. Speaking honestly, my efforts at renunciation are still very lukewarm, but this book is embedded in my subconscious and has helped me take on some of the ascetic practices recommended throughout." So I think that summary and that review is a good primer to catch your bearings on what the book is about. Take a look at this table of contents. You can see that. And there's all types of cool artwork like many esoteric books have. But anyway, moving on to the introduction. The author starts by welcoming the reader to the abyss, a place where you are snatched up, cast in the mud, and left there to rot. There is a metaphorical parasite in the heart, and surgery would only kill the subject. You must be clever and lure it out. It is a slow and uncomfortable process, where on a razor's thin margin, enough heat is applied to kill the virus, but not the host. Holmes writes, "It is harsh indeed, and it requires one to be humbled, exploited, broken, demoralized, stripped from hope, faith, and dignity." And he goes on, "No one submits to this voluntarily. We are talking about a mystical rather than magical process. Your will is not relevant here." In the abyss lurks a monster, Choronzon. Choronzon is a theoretical dark entity first documented by John Dee and Edward Kelly in the late 16th century. In 1909, Aleister Crowley supposedly evoked and overcame this formidable opponent, labeling it the Demon of Dispersion, describing it as a temporary personification of the chaotic forces of the abyss. Holmes writes, "His home is a dark ocean of agonizing feeling, specially designed by an evil archon to drown desire." Ironically enough, Choronzon is both the opposer and the motivator. Now, Crowley said that Choronzon's purpose was total annihilation of the traveler's ego, but Holmes cast doubt on taking this notion literally. He writes, "We shall consider another possibility, that the ego referred to in the ordeal of the abyss denotes specifically those social constructs enforced upon us from a toddling age, without which we can be more truly who we really are." To elaborate on this, Holmes turns to Freud's model of the psyche. It is made up of three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the most basic part of our psyche. It is in us from birth. It's the driver of our core needs. The ego, developed as a mediator between the environment and the id, controls impulses of the id based on unwanted consequences. The superego, or as it's known in esoteric circles, psychic sensor, is what we are taught from people we look up to and the culture and society we are brought up in. It's basically a list of do's and don'ts. Holmes states that in early adolescence, the ego overrides id, and as a result, ego divorces us from true will, in that magic is but one of the many techniques developed by the ego to supply both id's needs and its own desires. That is why magic does not work in the abyss. The abyss is a period of restructuring the ego. Holmes goes on to explain how an abyss-type event is triggered by the intervention of something in esoteric circles known as the HGA, or Holy Guardian Angel. He says, "Within the psychological model, I understand the Holy Guardian Angel as a part consciously and part unconsciously willed byproduct of the ego, specifically designed to reestablish a balanced communication with the id, in that restoring this channel is always painful." Holmes explains how the abyss takes on many forms. For the saint, the abyss is a time of martyrdom. For the artist, it's a lack of inspiration. For the magician, his wand is broken, his pentacle is defective, and his temple is profaned. For the quintessential dude, it's an unwavering series of bullshit, with the main hallmark being the occasional uncanny mega win which seemingly only perpetuates the paradox. I made that one up. Holmes goes on to explain that for the magician, the pursuit and passion for the art becomes a part of the practitioner's ego or outer shell, and likens it to a drug. Whereas with any drug, one becomes dependent, and if one should go without, they will inevitably fall into withdrawal. Holmes writes, "This refers to the challenging time when ego will be forced to reorganize itself in order to be able to solve the newly emergent conflicts between the id and the environment, of which the outcome will be, if successful, the alignment of its will with true nature, what is experienced as true will." He further writes, "Integration is the realization and acceptance of the unconscious parts of the psychic apparatus that have been rejected, denied, suppressed, neglected, and accumulated by the ego and the superego all over the years, and which forms a more or less aggregate entity we call alter ego or the shadow." He says, "For the magician, the abyss is an extremely turbulent and unmotivating period that calls for introspection, meditation, and revaluation. It is time for acknowledging his weaknesses and admitting there is something greater than him, whatever it may be, that nothing really is under control." In the introduction, Holmes goes on to speak about the abyss represented in the tarot by the hanged man forced to abandon everything he has. In alchemy, represented by the alchemical stage of Negredo, the blackening decomposition of matter symbolic of the dispersion of the ego. In astrology, by the planet Saturn associated with time, bondage, and harvest. One interesting topic is the concept of ritual death, often simulated in initiatic orders. He says, "The mystery cults of ancient Greece were replete with elements and rituals characteristic to the mytheme of the abyss that used to be reenacted every year by the Mysti, and that initiation, which is known to us mainly through Masonry and a few Victorian and contemporary magical orders, is highly inspired by the ordeal of the abyss." He suggests that these ceremonies are strong enough to repel the phony and offer the aspirant a glimpse of what they will face one day, and writes, "But the main gain of this ritual death seems to have been the opening of the probationer's mind to a transcendental world with spiritual values, which resulted in the conquering of fear of death and in gaining insight on the deep meaning of existence." According to Holmes, and I resonated with this idea, the abyss isn't necessarily a singular one-off event. It can be recurrent or cyclical. I like to think of how the Earth moves around the sun. It seems like we revolve, but if you put it in motion, it's actually like a corkscrew. Holmes explains that we can have several, if not many, radical life-changing events or experiences where the road to transformation is a rather tumultuous trip. The ancient Greeks had a name for the archetypal and sometimes literal descent into the underworld in search of understanding, and they called it katabasis. Holmes talks about certain Greek epics where the main character takes on this cyclical journey and is usually faced with uncertainty and impending threat. As the author illustrates, katabasis can be broken down into 4 phases. There's departure, descent, initiation, and return. In each of these 4 phases or seasons, he includes 3 alchemical processes. Holmes states how sacrifice, whether in a religious or magical context, refers to atonement. It is the reconciliation of divinity with humanity, or ego with id. It means resignation, abandonment to divine providence, and the acceptance of a transitory yet meaningful loss in return for a higher power gain. One of the themes expressed in this book relating to the abyss is that of sacrifice. When talking about sacrifice, it's not just death. Holmes states that scapegoating, ostracism, and exile, as much as forced labor and imprisonment, are also forms of sacrifice. He also highlights how some of these dynamics play out. In the same way we are taught from early childhood to suppress those parts in us that can be perceived either by ourselves or by others as unwanted, we also learn to enforce the suppression on others. He identifies the whole sacrificial theme in Kabbalah on the pillar of severity. It's finally in the experience of the abyss, represented by the Sephirah, Da'at, that the mystic repents and rectifies his flaws. Practically, this means surrendering to divine will and attaining freedom from what I took as lesser placeholding desires. This is where the approach of the ascetic shines, and the author gives many examples. I would recommend buying the book to get his breakdowns on mythology and all the practical work, but once again, we're just going over the notes. We're talking about transformation here, and the unique abyss type event that is marked by suffering that triggers that change. Holmes states that the main idea of the gnosis of suffering is that it aims to lead ultimately to enantiodromia, the principle whereby the superabundance of one force inevitably produces its opposite. So in a practical sense, what we're talking about with the ascetic approach includes things like fasting, sex deprivation, sexual abstinence, seclusion, voluntary poverty, tonsure, self-flagellation, the vow of silence, nonviolence, and motionlessness. In the chapter on the gnosis of suffering, the author talks about liberation from the wheel of fortune, where he differentiates fortune, fate, and destiny. Okay, fortune is related to chance. Fate is more related to a power that sets forth natural order, and destiny is the unescapable finished product of the two. These dynamics make up a triplet, the 3 faces of truth, which Holmes identifies with the archetypal triple goddess. He continues by sharing a Jewish fable, The Goat in the Room. Check out the description, I'll put a link in there for a good rundown of that. I think it really captures the idea that we think we want more, we don't realize what we have, and it's not until we do that we make room to grow. Suffering, in a roundabout way, offers this opportunity. Now we're moving on to the shadow, a bestiary of the abyss. As social creatures, we seek to fit in, and the parts of us that have what Holmes calls deviating inclinations tend to be suppressed and build up over time, creating an alter ego or shadow. If left unchecked, it can erupt with hostility. This is in line with Carl Jung's explanation of the shadow, where he says, "The shadow is the unknown dark side of the personality that is instinctive and irrational and prone to psychological projection on someone else." On a macro scale, like whole societies for instance, the shadow intrudes wearing a variety of masks. Holmes identifies some of them. The adversary, the initiator, the liberator, the punisher, the outcast, the psychopomp, the trickster, the beast, or the unknown. On a micro scale, the individual that is, Holmes identifies several shadow animals relating to the suppressed self. I'm just going to show you a few pages. He gives a good description on what these personifications of these suppressed tendencies represent. The rat, the moth, the fly, the bat, the toad, the goat. So, very interesting. So why is it important to understand the shadow? Holmes says that according to the sages of the past, the great work is attained by uniting the opposites: animal with divine, microcosm with macrocosm, female with male, conscious with unconscious. And how exactly do you do that? Holmes gives some recommendations. The best way to interact with the shadow is through dreams, in which it tends to appear as a person of the same gender or an animal, and a monster by extension. In such events, the magician should neither ignore it nor try to fight it. He will fail. He should not give the shadow what it wants either, for this will lead to disaster. The magician is, instead, advised to actively listen to it, which is the first step for this crisis negotiation, and then show empathy, which means the pacification of opposites. Develop rapport by expressing your feelings to the shadow. It'll start to trust you. So what is the ideal outcome to confronting the shadow, stepping in the abyss, and taking on the chaos? Holmes states that if one successfully weathers the suffering and slow down of time in that vacuum, the reward is rebirth. He says that while part of us dies in the abyss, another is conceived there, truer, stronger, and wiser. He says that true consciousness, true will that is a mirror that reflects the universe, and that the mirror of truth is the mask of God. That is why God seems invisible to us. That is why when we look at him, we can only see ourselves. He goes on with, one day, the babe of the abyss opens his eyes and everything is new to him. Everything remains the same and yet different. He knows that he knows nothing, and through this principle, he knows everything. He no longer fears death, for death exerts no power over his consciousness. His name is Nemo, which means no man. The abyss is kept present in Nemo's consciousness, but functioning in a different manner. It is like a memory and a sensation accompanying it. For Nemo, the abyss is like a seventh sense, the abyss sense, or absence. With the abyss ever present like a dog biting his ankles, the holy madman wanders about the world, professing his antinomian truth to those who have ears to hear and eyes to see. And as the fool, the spirit of the aether, he restarts this journey of the magus of power after having conquered the world in the night of time.